Marcus Reyes bought the house at 4417 Larkspur Court for the driveway, not the granite countertops, not the finished basement with its slightly damp smell that the inspector had waved off as normal for the region, not even the backyard, which backed onto a stand of maples that turned the color of a struck match every October. He bought it for 22 feet of clean, wide, freshly sealed concrete that could fit his F-150 with room to spare. Room enough to walk the dog around it without stepping into the grass. Room enough, he sometimes thought, standing at the kitchen window with his coffee, to feel like something in his life had finally stopped being cramped. 11 years he'd spent parallel parking a truck on a cracked apartment complex lot in Dayton, squeezing between a landlord's boat trailer and a neighbor's motorcycle that never moved, before the divorce settlement finally cleared and he had enough, just enough, to put down on a modest colonial in a subdivision called Willowbrook Glen. He remembered the walkthrough vividly, the realtor rattling off square footage while Marcus stood in the driveway, doing something closer to falling in love. He signed the closing papers 11 months before any of this started, and for most of that first year, the driveway was exactly what he'd imagined. Quiet. His. By the second week of March, someone else's white Cadillac Escalade was parked in it. Marcus stood on his porch at 6:47 p.m., holding a bag of takeout that was starting to go cold, staring at a vehicle that was not his, in a driveway that unmistakably was, blocking his own truck from getting anywhere near the garage. There was a note tucked under the wiper, written on Willowbrook Glen Homeowners Association letterhead in loopy, confident cursive, the kind of handwriting that assumed forgiveness before it had been asked for. Marcus, hope you don't mind. My driveway's getting seal-coated and there was nowhere else. Back by 8. Denise Calloway, president of the Willowbrook Glen Homeowners Association. A title she wore the way some people wear a uniform they've forgotten isn't actually required off-duty. She lived 2 doors down at 4421 Larkspur Court, in a house with a driveway of her own. Narrower than Marcus's, admittedly, an accident of the original lot survey that had bothered her, according to neighborhood lore, since the day she and her husband Rick moved in back in 2013. And she had, without asking, without so much as a knock on the door, decided that Marcus Reyes's driveway was an extension of her own property whenever her own happened to be inconvenient. He didn't think much of it. Everyone gets a rough week. He moved his truck to the curb, ate his cold pad thai standing at the kitchen counter with the lights off because he was too tired to turn them on, and figured that would be the end of it. It was the beginning of it. By the third occurrence in April, the note stopped apologizing. It read, in its entirety, "Driveway guy again. Back soon." There was no question mark this time. No acknowledgement that a question had ever existed to answer. By the 5th, in May, there was no note at all. Just the Escalade, gleaming and enormous, parked dead center in his driveway, like the concrete itself had personally invited it, like Marcus's ownership of the property was a technicality that had quietly expired sometime in April without his noticing. What Denise Calloway did not know, what she could not have known, standing at her own kitchen window 2 doors down, congratulating herself on a driveway problem solved yet again, was that Marcus Reyes worked in warehouse logistics for a distribution center out in Groveport, and his entire professional life, for the better part of a decade, had been built on exactly one transferable skill: tracking things. Every pallet, every shipment manifest, every discrepancy between what a client ordered and what a truck actually delivered, time-stamped and logged in a spreadsheet until the pattern told its own story, whether or not anyone wanted to hear it. She had just handed him a pattern. "Drop your city and tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many of you are watching this from behind enemy lines right now." Willowbrook Glen sits on the northern edge of Maple Ridge, Ohio, a township of roughly 14,000 people that mostly makes the local news for its 4th of July parade and, somewhat less charmingly, for a string of small claims filings against its own homeowners association that had accumulated over the years like sediment nobody wanted to dredge up. The neighborhood itself was built out in phases starting in 2011. 68 lots total. A shared retention pond nobody was legally permitted to fish in, despite the bass that had somehow colonized it anyway. A community entrance sign lit by 2 solar lamps that had needed replacing since roughly 2019, and a set of covenants, conditions, and restrictions running to 41 dense pages that every homeowner signed at closing, and precisely none of them, Marcus would eventually learn, had ever read past page 3. Marcus had read all 41 pages, twice. Not because he suspected trouble. He simply liked knowing what he was buying into. A habit left over from a decade of contracts and shipping manifests where the fine print was frequently the only part that mattered. He remembered thinking, at the time, that Section 7 on parking regulations was almost aggressively specific for a subdivision with 68 ordinary driveways. Section 7.4, he recalled almost verbatim, "No vehicle shall be parked on any lot, other than in the garage or driveway appurtenant to that lot, except for temporary guest parking, not to exceed 48 hours, and no owner or resident shall permit or authorize the parking of any vehicle on a lot not owned or leased by them without the express written consent of the lot owner." He remembered that clause specifically because it seemed to anticipate a scenario he'd assumed, reading it over coffee in his old apartment the week before closing, would never actually happen to him, a neighbor parking on his property without asking. It had felt, at the time, like an abstraction, a hypothetical drafted by some HOA attorney years ago to cover every conceivable edge case. He had not imagined the edge case would arrive in the form of a woman 2 doors down with a laminated board title and an Escalade she couldn't fit in her own driveway. Denise Calloway had been president of the Willowbrook Glen HOA for 6 years running, re-elected each cycle by a rotating board of 4 other homeowners who mostly wanted the meetings to end early enough to still catch the second half of whatever game was on. She was 53, drove the Escalade like it was a company vehicle, even though the only company involved was a homeowners association carrying a $340,000 reserve fund and levying a $412 quarterly due on every household in the subdivision. And she had built, over those 6 years, a particular kind of reputation. Not a reputation for corruption exactly. Nothing so dramatic. Nothing anyone could point to and call criminal. At least, not yet. A reputation, instead, for convenience. Denise Calloway did not wait in lines. Denise Calloway did not fill out forms twice, did not double-check a covenant citation before sending it, did not particularly worry about whether a rule applied to her the same way it applied to everyone else. When her own driveway was inconvenient, too narrow for the Escalade and Rick's truck and her son Tyler's Jeep all at once, a chronic condition of that particular lot going back to the day they'd moved in, she simply solved the problem the way she solved most problems, by using someone else's driveway, usually Marcus's, lately. Occasionally the Kowalskis at 4413, though Frank Kowalski was 71, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant, and had informed her once, without much diplomacy and considerably less patience, that he'd have her towed the next time he found her Escalade parked where his truck belonged. She had not tried it again with Frank. Frank scared her a little, in the specific way that people who have genuinely stopped caring what anyone thinks of them tend to scare people who have built their entire social position on being liked. Marcus Reyes, quiet, 39, recently divorced, new to the neighborhood, working long shifts and generally too tired at the end of the day to make a scene. Marcus Reyes did not scare her at all. Marcus's house sat at the elbow of Larkspur Court, where the street curved gently and the driveways naturally angled toward one another, in a way that made his and Denise's practically neighbors in the truest sense, close enough to see each other's porch lights come on at dusk. His neighbor to the left, Priya Anand, a soft-spoken pharmacist with a small but stubborn vegetable garden along her back fence, had warned him about the HOA within his first month on the street. "They fined me $75 for a garden gnome," she told him one evening over the fence, watering a row of tomato plants that were themselves, technically, a Section 9.2 violation, pending an appeal that had been pending, at that point, for over a year. Denise said it violated the community's aesthetic uniformity standard. I looked it up. There is no aesthetic uniformity standard anywhere in the Declaration. I made her cite the actual section in writing. She never did. She just quietly stopped mentioning it after I asked twice. "Did you fight it?" "I paid it." Priya shrugged in a way that suggested this wasn't really a policy, so much as a survival strategy she'd arrived at through trial and error. $75 isn't worth the headache, or the 2 months of passive-aggressive emails that come with fighting it. Pick your battles. That's the whole neighborhood's unofficial motto around here. Denise counts on it. She's built 6 years of a very comfortable presidency on people doing exactly what I did. Marcus had nodded along at the time, filed it away somewhere in the back of his mind, next to 100 other small warnings people give you about a new place, and gone back to unpacking boxes. He had no intention, that spring, of picking any battles with anyone. He'd just come out of a divorce that had cost him a house in Powell, half a retirement account, and most of a year of his emotional bandwidth. What he wanted, more than anything, was quiet. He wanted a driveway he could park his truck in without incident, and a neighborhood where nobody asked him for anything he hadn't offered first. Now that you know Marcus, has your HOA ever pulled something that made your blood boil? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has ever done to you, in the comments below. The first note under the wiper, back in March, hadn't bothered him at all, if he was honest with himself. The second, in April, "Sorry again. Driveway guy ran late." XOZOD had made him roll his eyes, but nothing more. The mild irritation of a stranger's minor inconvenience, briefly overlapping with his own. It was the third time in early May, arriving home from a 10-hour shift, to find the Escalade sitting in his driveway with no note at all, no acknowledgement, nothing, that something in him quietly reorganized itself. He stood there in the gathering dusk, with his takeout going cold for the second time in 2 months, and thought, with the flat clarity of a man doing inventory at the end of a long day, this isn't a favor anymore. This is a habit. And habits, in Marcus's professional experience, only ever went one direction if nobody interrupted them. He knocked on Denise's door that night, the third time, still in his work clothes, the smell of the warehouse floor still on his jacket. She answered in workout clothes, a glass of white wine already in hand, mildly surprised to find him standing on her porch at all, as though the very idea of Marcus objecting to anything had never crossed her mind. "Marcus, everything okay? Your Escalade's in my driveway again." "Oh, right, sorry, I meant to leave a note this time. My driveway's just so tight with Rick's truck home this week, and you're never back until after 6 anyway, so I figured it wouldn't really matter to you either way." "I'd like it to stop," Marcus said, not angry, just direct, the way he'd correct a shipping error, stating a fact and waiting to see if it registered. Denise's smile didn't move, exactly, but something behind it recalibrated, the particular expression of a woman quietly filing away a name on a mental list she kept for people who apparently didn't understand how things worked around here, in her neighborhood, on her street. "Of course. No problem at all. I'll move it right now, I promise." She moved it that night, under his watch, with an apology that sounded rehearsed even as she said it for the first time. She did not stop. Between May and July, Marcus counted 11 more incidents, each one logged first in a note on his phone he told himself was purely practical. Date, time found, time removed, whether a note had been left, whether an apology had accompanied it. He told himself he was just being organized, the way he was organized about everything in his life, since the divorce had taught him that disorganization was how people lost things that mattered. He did not yet think of it as evidence. That reframing came later, on a Tuesday in July, the day the first letter arrived. The letter came on Willowbrook Glen, HOA letterhead, dated July 14th, addressed to Marcus Reyes at 4417 Larkspur Court, and it was not, notably, about Denise Calloway's Escalade. Notice of Covenant Violation, Section 6.3, Trash Receptacle Storage. It has come to the board's attention that trash and recycling receptacles at the above address have been visible from the street outside the permitted collection window. 6 a.m., 8 p.m., day of collection. A fine of $50 has been assessed. Failure to remedy within 10 days will result in additional fines of $25 per day. Marcus read it twice, standing at his own kitchen counter still in his work boots, and felt something click into place with an almost audible sound, like a lock finding its groove. His trash cans had been out for exactly as long as everyone else's on the street, no more, no less. He'd started paying attention to that sort of thing without quite admitting to himself why. He'd watched Priya's sit at the curb until 9, some nights without so much as a warning letter. He'd watched the Kowalskis leave theirs out overnight entirely before pickup, a genuine violation by any reading of Section 6.3, without so much as a courtesy notice. Nobody else on the street had gotten a letter that week, only him. He wrote it off as coincidence for exactly 1 week, until the second letter arrived. Section 8.1, Unauthorized Landscaping Alteration, Mulch Color Non-Compliant with Community Standard, $50. He had not touched his mulch since moving in 11 months earlier. The mulch had been there since the previous owner, a fact that was easily verifiable and that, he suspected, nobody on the board had bothered to check before sending the letter. Then the third, 10 days after that, in early August. Section 5.4, Holiday Decoration Timing, Decorations displayed outside the permitted 30-day window. He had, in fact, left a single string of solar-powered lawn lights up 2 weeks past the 4th of July, a fact he could not entirely dispute, except that the Petersons, 2 houses down at 4402, had a full inflatable Uncle Sam still standing proudly in their front yard, untouched, unfined, unremarked upon by anyone. 3 letters, 3 fines, $150 total, with the daily accrual threat baked into every single one, arriving in the 10 weeks following the night he'd knocked on Denise Calloway's door and asked her, politely, calmly, to stop parking in his driveway. He mentioned it to Frank Kowalski over the fence one Saturday, half joking at first, testing the water the way you test whether a stranger shares your read on a situation. Frank didn't laugh. Frank set down the hose entirely, which Marcus would come to learn was Frank's version of standing at attention. She'd do that to you before or after you asked her to stop blocking your driveway. After. Yeah, Frank nodded slowly, like a man confirming a diagnosis he'd already privately suspected for some time. She did something real similar to the Ferraros back in 21. You never met them, moved out before you got here. Rick Ferraro complained at a meeting about her running board business without a quorum present, just her and one other board member making decisions that were supposed to need 3. 2 weeks later, Ferraros are getting fined for a shed that had been standing in their backyard untouched since 2015. 4 notices in 6 weeks. They fought it a little, then they got tired. Then they sold. Sold at a loss, too, on account of a lien Denise's board slapped on the house for unpaid fines right before the closing date. Cost them almost $9,000 to clear it before the sale could even go through. $9,000, Marcus, for a shed nobody had ever once complained about in 6 years. Marcus felt something in his stomach go cold and very still. That can't actually be legal. It's technically legal, Frank said, in the tone of a man who had looked into it once, years ago, out of curiosity, and regretted knowing the answer ever since. CC&Rs give the board authority to levy fines and record liens for unpaid assessments and fines. Doesn't matter, on paper, if the fines themselves are retaliatory, as long as the paperwork just says violation and cites some section number. Proving retaliation in front of a judge is a whole different fight, a harder one, an expensive one. Most people don't have the stomach, or the spare cash, or the spare year of their life to take that fight on. Denise knows that better than anyone. It's not an accident. It's the whole business model, near as I can tell. And I've been on this street since before she was even elected. Marcus went home that night and did not sleep particularly well. He kept turning over the phrase "the whole business model" in his mind. The idea that a 53-year-old woman with a white Escalade and a laminated title had built, patiently, over 6 years, a quiet little system where using her position on a 5-person volunteer board could function as leverage against anyone who inconvenienced her, even slightly, and that the system worked precisely because most people would rather eat $150 in fines or $9,000 in lien fees than spend the next year of their life fighting a homeowners association that had a legal fund of its own and a fiduciary duty that, as far as Marcus could tell, nobody had ever actually bothered to enforce. He thought seriously about just paying the fines. He thought about it for the better part of a full day, turning it over while he loaded pallets at the warehouse, while he sat in traffic on 270, while he microwaved dinner alone, in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the previous owner's cooking, 11 months later. Priya's advice rattled around his skull the whole time. Pick your battles, it's not worth the headache. He was tired. He worked 50-hour weeks that left him with barely enough energy to make dinner, let alone fight a war. He had come out of a divorce that had already cost him more fights than he had reserves left to survive gracefully. $150. It would be so easy to write the check and never think about any of it again. Then he thought about the driveway. 22 feet of clean, wide concrete he had chosen this entire house for, the one part of his new, smaller, quieter life that was supposed to be entirely, unambiguously his own. He thought about standing on his porch with cold takeout in a plastic bag, watching someone else's Cadillac sit in the one square of the world he'd been counting on nobody else touching. He did not pay the fines. Instead, on a Wednesday night in late July, Marcus Reyes opened a blank spreadsheet on his laptop at the kitchen table and started a new tab. He labeled it with the same flat, procedural instinct he brought to every discrepancy report at the warehouse. The same instinct that had once caught a supplier quietly shorting pallets by 2 units a shipment for the better part of a year before anyone else noticed. Willowbrook. Documentation. He built it the way he'd have built any inventory audit. Columns for date, time, description, photo reference, witness if any, and outcome. Then he went back through his phone, through old texts to himself, through the mental notes he'd been keeping half-consciously since March, and reconstructed everything he could recall with as much precision as memory allowed. 14 occurrences of the Escalade in his driveway between March and July, 11 of which he could date to within a day, and 4 of which he had actual photographs for, time-stamped automatically by his phone. 3 retaliatory pattern fine notices in 10 weeks, all issued within days of documented complaints to Denise directly, none of which corresponded to violations that any of his neighbors, who were doing objectively similar or worse things with their own trash cans, mulch, and holiday decorations, had ever received so much as a warning for. He cross-referenced dates against his own work schedule to rule out coincidence. He printed photographs at the drugstore because paper felt more permanent than a phone that could be lost, dropped, or stolen. He kept a physical folder in a drawer next to a digital one backed up automatically to a cloud account because Marcus Reyes did not trust systems that could be quietly erased by the one person who had every motive in the world to erase them. He also did something that same week, that he probably should have done back in March, before any of this started. He pulled up the full Maple Ridge Municipal Code online and actually read it, rather than assuming the HOA's authority was the only authority that mattered on Larkspur Court. It took him 20 minutes on the township's clunky, poorly indexed website to find what he was looking for, buried deep in Chapter 335, Traffic and Vehicles, a section he suspected almost nobody in Willowbrook Glen had ever bothered to open. Section 335, 1-4, Obstruction of Private Driveways. No person shall park, stand, or leave standing any vehicle in a manner that obstructs, in whole or in part, a private driveway without the express permission of the property owner. Violation is a minor misdemeanor, punishable by fine and subject to vehicle removal at owner's expense. It wasn't just an HOA covenant issue, buried inside 41 pages that a private board could interpret however it pleased. It was a municipal ordinance, a police matter, with its own separate enforcement mechanism entirely outside Denise Calloway's control, which meant Marcus Reyes now had two completely independent systems he could use against her, and Denise Calloway, for all 6 years of quiet, comfortable, unquestioned leverage, had apparently never once imagined that anyone on Larkspur Court would bother learning either one well enough to use it. The next time the Escalade appeared in his driveway, Saturday, August 9th, 11:14 in the morning, blocking Marcus from backing his truck out for a hardware store run he'd been putting off for 2 weeks, he did not knock on Denise's door. He did not leave a note of his own, tucked politely under her wiper. He picked up his phone and called the Maple Ridge Police Department's non-emergency line. "I've got a vehicle blocking my private driveway," he told the dispatcher. Calm, factual, the same tone he used reporting a discrepancy on a shipping manifest, giving his address, giving the license plate he'd photographed months earlier, and never once needed, until precisely this moment. "It's happened repeatedly. I have documentation going back to March if it's needed." An officer arrived 40 minutes later, a young guy, Officer Delacroix, who looked at the Escalade, looked at Marcus's clearly marked driveway, looked at the photographs on Marcus's phone showing the same vehicle in the same spot on 6 prior documented dates, and said, with the weary patience of a man who had evidently worked this particular subdivision before and knew exactly the kind of call this was likely to be, "You want it towed, or you want me to knock on the door first and give her a chance?" "Knock first," Marcus said. "Let's give her the chance to move it herself before it goes any further than it needs to." Denise answered her own door in under 20 seconds. She'd clearly been watching from the window the whole time, waiting to see how long the truck would sit there, and her face, when she registered the patrol car parked at the curb, did something complicated and unpracticed. Surprise first, then something closer to genuine insult, as though the entire situation, the mere presence of law enforcement, were somehow beneath the dignity owed to a homeowners association president. "Officer, this is really not necessary. I'm just parked in my neighbor's driveway for a bit. We have an understanding." "Ma'am, is this your neighbor's driveway?" "Well, technically, yes, but Marcus and I have an arrangement, don't we, Marcus?" "Do you, Mr. Reyes?" Officer Delacroix asked, without even turning around to look at her, in a voice that suggested he already suspected exactly what the answer was going to be. "No," Marcus said. "We do not have an arrangement. We never have." Denise moved the Escalade herself, that time, under the direct observation of a Maple Ridge patrol officer, on a Saturday morning, in front of Priya Anand, who happened to be out at her own mailbox at exactly the wrong, or from Marcus's perspective, exactly the right, moment, and who texted 3 other neighbors about it within the hour, because that is simply what happens on a street of 68 households, where nothing much ever happens at all. It was, Marcus would think much later, lying awake that night, turning the whole afternoon over in his mind, the first time in 6 years that anyone on Larkspur Court had actually watched Denise Calloway lose at something, in public, in real time. She did not take it well. The fourth fine notice arrived 4 days later, dated August 13th. This one was different from the first three. Not petty, not a mere $50 tucked in an envelope that could be quietly ignored. This one had teeth, and it was clearly meant to. Notice of Special Assessment and Violation, Sections 4.7 and 11.2. It has come to the board's attention that the owner at 4417 Larkspur Court has engaged in conduct detrimental to the association, including the involvement of law enforcement in a private neighbor dispute in violation of the community's Good Neighbor Policy, Section 11.2. The board hereby levies a fine of $250, along with prior unpaid fines totaling $150, for a combined balance of $400 due within 30 days. Failure to remit payment may result in the recording of an association lien against the property pursuant to Section 12.3 of the Declaration. Marcus read it 3 times at his kitchen counter before the sheer audacity of it fully landed. There was no good neighbor policy anywhere in Section 11.2 or anywhere else in the Declaration for that matter. He knew the CC&Rs cold by this point. He'd read them a 3rd time just the week before, highlighting every parking clause, every enforcement provision, every fine schedule with a yellow marker until the margins looked like a law student's exam prep. Section 11.2, in its actual unambiguous text, governed pet waste disposal requirements along the community's shared walking trail. There was nothing anywhere in the entire 41-page document about contacting law enforcement, because no association, anywhere, could lawfully fine a homeowner for exercising a basic legal right to call the police on his own property. He knew that instinctively, the way you know cold water is cold, he would soon know it as a matter of settled case law too, and hear it stated plainly by a judge in a Franklin County courtroom. But the letter, he understood even as he read it that first time, wasn't really about Section 11.2 at all. It was a message, dressed up carefully in the costume of a policy citation. You embarrassed me in front of a police officer, on my own street, in front of a neighbor who was watching, and now you will pay for it, in dollars, on paper, where it can look official. $400 over a fabricated policy that didn't exist, stacked on top of 3 fines that were never legitimate to begin with. Against Marcus Reyes, for the crime of calling the police on his own property. Is this even legal where you live? What would you have done in his position? And the lien threat. That was the part that genuinely kept Marcus up that night, staring at his bedroom ceiling, doing the exact math Frank Kowalski had already done for him weeks earlier, without being asked. A lien on a house worth roughly $340,000. A lien that could compound with interest and recording fees, that could sit quietly on the public title for months or years, that could, if it ever came down to it, if Marcus ever needed to sell, or refinance, or borrow against the equity he'd spent the better part of a decade building, become a genuine 5-figure problem, born entirely out of one woman's unwillingness to walk an extra 90 feet to her own front door. He thought about Rick and Amy Ferraro. $9,000, cleared right before closing, just to get out from under a lien that had started, as far as Marcus could piece together from what Frank remembered, over a shed, and a complaint about a missed quorum. The neighborhood noticed, the way neighborhoods always eventually notice. Priya texted him a photo of her own mailbox that same week. Denise had apparently walked the entire street personally that Sunday afternoon, reviewing landscaping compliance, and had left fresh courtesy notices on 3 separate houses about hedge height, none of which had ever been raised as an issue before, on hedges that had been the same height for at least 2 growing seasons. The message wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. Marcus wasn't just being fined. He was quietly, deliberately, being made an example of, to remind the rest of Larkspur Court exactly what happened to people who stopped picking their battles, the way Priya had taught him, half-jokingly, that first month. At the next scheduled HOA board meeting, August 21st, in the clubhouse rec room that smelled faintly of chlorine drifting over from the adjacent community pool. Folding chairs arranged in 6 uneven rows for maybe 15 attendees out of 68 total households. Marcus showed up for the first time in the 11 months he'd lived in Willowbrook Glen. Denise ran the meeting from behind a folding table at the front of the room, flanked by 2 board members who mostly nodded along at whatever she said, and one, a soft-spoken accountant named Harold Fenn, who kept glancing at his phone under the table, like a man who had somewhere else he badly wished he could be. When the meeting reached its scheduled public comment period, Marcus stood. "I'd like clarification on the fine I received under Section 11.2, he said, keeping his voice level, the exact tone he'd use, reporting a shipping discrepancy to a supervisor who very much did not want to hear about it. Section 11.2 in the Declaration governs pet waste disposal. It doesn't reference law enforcement contact anywhere, and I've had a certified copy of the CC&Rs since closing 11 months ago. Can the board point me to the specific provision that was actually violated here?" There was a pause that ran a beat too long. Harold Fenn looked, for one entirely unguarded second, like a man who badly wished he'd read the letter more carefully before it ever went out under his own signature as a board member. "The board has discretion to interpret community standards as a whole," Denise said smoothly, though her voice had picked up a slightly higher register than usual, and calling the police over what was, frankly, a neighborly favor, gone slightly sideways, created a hostile environment for the entire. "I'd also like it noted for the record," Marcus continued, not raising his voice at all, "that the vehicle in question was parked in my driveway without my consent on at least 14 separate occasions between March and August of this year, in direct and repeated violation of Section 7.4, which the board has taken no enforcement action on whatsoever against anyone in that same period." The room went very quiet. Priya, sitting 3 rows back with her arms folded, did not bother hiding her smile. Frank Kowalski, standing near the back wall because the folding chairs had run out before he'd bothered to sit, made a small sound that might charitably have been described as a laugh. That's a personal matter between neighbors," Denise said, color rising visibly in her face now. "It's not something the board needs to weigh in on." "It became a board issue," Marcus said quietly, "the moment the board issued a $250 fine referencing it directly." He sat back down. The meeting moved on, at least on paper, to a scheduled discussion about reserve fund allocation for the upcoming pool resurfacing project, but nobody in that room, Marcus included, was thinking very hard about the pool. Denise adjourned the meeting 12 minutes earlier than scheduled, which Frank Kowalski would later tell Marcus with a dry look was something close to a personal record for her. She did not rescind the fine. Marcus hadn't expected her to. Not really. Not yet. But he had accomplished what he'd actually come there to do. Not to win the room outright, not this early, but to get the retaliation on the public record, in front of witnesses who would remember it, in a way that couldn't later be quietly smoothed over or omitted from meeting minutes the way Denise had, Marcus increasingly suspected, quietly smoothed over a few other inconvenient details across the last 6 years. He went home that night and added the meeting to his spreadsheet. Date, time, description, names of witnesses present. Then he opened a new tab and typed a header that felt, in that moment, like the true beginning of everything that followed. Next steps. The lien was recorded on September 9th. Marcus found out about it not from a letter, not from Denise, not from anyone on the board, but from a title company, of all unlikely sources. He'd called that week to ask about current refinancing rates, a routine call he'd been meaning to make for months to see if he could shave a point off his mortgage. And the woman on the line had gone quiet for a beat too long before saying, carefully, "Sir, there appears to be an active HOA lien on the property, filed with the county recorder on September 9th, in the amount of $400, plus $75 in recording and administrative fees. That would need to be resolved before any refinance could move forward. He sat in his truck in the hardware store parking lot for 11 full minutes after that call ended, engine running, doing nothing but breathing and staring at the dashboard. It wasn't really the money. $475 wasn't nothing, but it wasn't the kind of number that would sink him financially. It was the shape of the thing, a public record now, attached permanently to his house, his name, visible to any lender, any future buyer, any title search, run for as long as it sat there unresolved, all because Denise Calloway hadn't wanted to walk an extra 90 feet to her own front door back in March. That was the week the neighborhood began, quietly and almost politely, to shun him. Not everyone. Priya brought over a casserole entirely unprompted one evening and said, flatly, standing on his porch in her scrubs, "I heard about the lien from Frank. That's insane, Marcus. Genuinely insane. Let me know if you ever need a witness for anything, court or otherwise." Frank Kowalski, for his part, started quietly leaving his own outdoor security camera footage on a thumb drive in Marcus's mailbox, without being asked, timestamps intact, covering the exact stretch of street where the Escalade usually parked. A small, unspoken act of solidarity from a man who didn't waste words on sentiment. But others, the Petersons, the Whitfields, a retired couple named the Osei Boatengs who'd lived in Willowbrook Glen since the very first phase broke ground back in 2011, got noticeably, deliberately cooler toward him. Small things, mostly. A wave that used to happen automatically at the mailbox simply stopped happening. An invitation to a neighborhood block cookout that had, in every prior year anyone could remember, gone out to every single house on the street, arrived that September at every house except 4417. He understood it, in a distant, almost clinical way, the same way he understood a supply chain bottleneck, not personally, just structurally. Denise Calloway controlled architectural approvals for every fence and shed and paint color on the street. She controlled fine enforcement. She effectively controlled the annual budget vote. Through 6 years of relationships, built one small favor and one small overlooked violation at a time. People weren't choosing Denise because they particularly liked her, Marcus suspected. They were choosing, very simply, not to be next. His ex-wife texted him, oddly, that same week. A mutual friend from their old life in Powell had apparently mentioned the whole situation to her, and she'd sent, entirely unprompted, "Sounds like your new neighborhood is worse than our old marriage, lol." He didn't laugh. He didn't not laugh either. He sat with the accuracy of it for a long minute before finally deleting the thread without responding. The personal cost accumulated in ways that never quite made it into a spreadsheet. He stopped sleeping well most nights. He caught himself, twice that September, drafting an email to a real estate agent just to see, out of pure exhausted curiosity, what the house might fetch if he simply walked away the way the Ferraros had before him, cut his losses, eat the lien as a cost of doing business, start over somewhere without a Denise Calloway, 2 doors down, watching his driveway. He hated himself a little for even opening that email draft both times. He deleted it both times, too, before ever hitting send. What kept him from actually sending it wasn't pride, exactly, though pride was certainly in the mix somewhere. It was the driveway, still, 22 feet of concrete he'd fallen in love with on a Tuesday afternoon walkthrough almost a year earlier, back when the worst thing in his life had been a mediation appointment about who got to keep the good couch. He was not, he decided somewhere around the 3rd week of September, going to let a woman with a Cadillac and a laminated section number take that from him too, on top of everything else the last 2 years had already taken. He called a lawyer. Not a $400 an hour downtown firm. A solo practitioner named Denise Okoro. A coincidence of names Marcus found darkly funny, given everything already unfolding. Who specialized, according to her modest website, in HOA and community association disputes, small claims, and lien removal. Her office sat above a dry cleaner in Maple Ridge's Old Town Square, up a narrow flight of stairs that creaked in a way Marcus found oddly reassuring, like the office of someone who'd been doing this work long enough not to need a fancier address. Attorney Okoro read through Marcus's spreadsheet, the 14 documented driveway incidents, the 3 retaliatory fine notices, the fabricated Section 11.2 citation, the $475 lien, in about 4 minutes flat, then set the folder down on her desk and looked at him steadily over the top of her reading glasses. "This is one of the cleaner retaliation cases I've seen come through this office in a while," she said. "Most people walk in here with a mess of feelings and no actual documentation to back any of it up. You've built a paper trail a first-year associate could win a case on. Can they actually fine me for calling the police? No, absolutely not. And I mean that as a settled matter of law, not merely my opinion. An HOA cannot lawfully penalize a homeowner for exercising a protected legal right. Contacting law enforcement on one's own private property is about as protected an act as exists under the law. The Section 11.2 citation is fabricated on its face. It governs pet waste, full stop, and even setting that aside, there's no clause anywhere in your declaration authorizing fines for contacting police, because such a clause would be void and unenforceable the moment anyone tried to write it. What we have here, she tapped the folder twice with one finger, is a documented pattern of retaliatory enforcement immediately following a homeowner's complaint. A fabricated violation, invented specifically to justify a punitive fine, and a lien, recorded in what looks very much like bad faith, used to leverage that fine into something that could genuinely threaten your ability to refinance or eventually sell this property. That's not simply an HOA dispute anymore, Marcus. That's a fiduciary duty violation by the board president personally, and depending on exactly how the rest of the board approved or rubber-stamped it, possibly the whole board collectively. What does all that mean for me? Practically speaking, it means we have 3 separate moves available, and I'd strongly recommend pursuing all 3 in parallel. She counted them off on her fingers, one at a time. 1. A small claims action against Denise Calloway individually, and potentially against the association itself, for trespass and the unauthorized use of your driveway, plus a claim for wrongful lien under state statute, which typically carries statutory penalties on top of your actual damages whenever a lien is recorded in demonstrated bad faith. 2. A formal written records request to the association demanding 6 years of board meeting minutes and prior violation enforcement history, because if this is genuinely a pattern going back to the Ferraros, and Frank Kowalski's account certainly suggests it is, that's powerful evidence in front of a judge, and frankly, it will be just as powerful in front of your own neighbors once they see it laid out plainly. 3. Depending on exactly what those records ultimately show, we file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, because homeowners associations in this state carry real fiduciary obligations to their members, obligations that don't simply evaporate just because nobody has ever bothered to enforce them before now. Marcus sat with all of that for a long moment, turning it over. I don't want to burn the whole neighborhood down over this. I just want my driveway back, and I want this lien off my house. Then we start with the lien and the small claims filing, Attorney Okoro said simply. But request the records anyway, regardless. Even if you ultimately never end up using them, you'll want to know exactly what you're actually dealing with here. Marcus just made a critical move, hiring an HOA attorney and demanding 6 years of board records instead of quietly paying the lien to make it go away. Was that the right call? What's your strategy? Tell me in the comments. The records request went out on September 22nd, citation and all, drafted with surgical precision by Attorney Okoro, the applicable state statute requiring homeowners associations to provide members access to books, records, and financial statements upon proper written request within a reasonable time, typically 10 to 30 business days, depending on the specific category of record requested. The request covered 6 full years of board meeting minutes, 6 years of violation notices issued broken down by address, 6 years of fine collection records, and any and all correspondence regarding vehicle parking, specifically on Larkspur Court. The association had 30 days to comply under the statute. They took 31, and what finally arrived was, in Attorney Okoro's professional and somewhat understated assessment, aggressively incomplete. 2 full years of minutes redacted for privacy reasons that were never further specified. A violation log with entire quarters simply missing without explanation. And no parking correspondence whatsoever, a detail that struck both Marcus and his attorney as immediately suspicious, given that Marcus's own phone had photographic timestamps documenting the Escalade going back all the way to March. Timestamps the association had every reason to know existed by now. "They're stalling," Attorney Okoro said, entirely unbothered, flipping through the thin stack of paper that had cost 31 days and a certified letter to produce. "That's fine, in the strategic sense. Incomplete production following a lawful records request is its own separate problem for them, and it tells a judge something important all on its own, namely, that there's something specific in those missing quarters they would very much prefer a judge never sees. What the incomplete records did manage to show, buried in a spreadsheet nobody on the current board had apparently thought to scrub before releasing it, was a fine collection ledger listing 61 separate violation notices issued over an 18-month window, cross-referenced by address. Marcus and Attorney Okoro sat together at her small conference table one evening in early October, going through the ledger line by careful line, and a pattern slowly emerged that neither of them had fully expected going in. Not merely retaliation against Marcus alone, but a broader, older rhythm stretching back across years. The Ferraros, back in 2021, fined over a shed that had stood undisturbed since 2015. 4 notices inside 6 weeks, immediately following a complaint about a missed quorum, followed eventually by a lien, followed 18 months later by a sale at a loss. A family named Ruiz, in 2022, fined over a basketball hoop that had stood in their own driveway since 2013, without complaint, 3 notices inside 5 weeks, following what the surviving minutes vaguely referenced, in a single passive voice sentence, as a disagreement regarding pool committee assignments. And now Marcus, in 2026, 3 fabricated notices, plus a 4th, invented outright, following a documented complaint about the board president's own personal vehicle. "This isn't a one-off situation," Attorney Okoro said quietly, closing her laptop with a soft click. "This is a method, a repeatable one, and now we can actually prove it." It was around this point, in early October, that the whole situation took a turn Marcus hadn't fully anticipated, though in hindsight, perhaps he should have. Someone leaked it. He never found out for absolutely certain who. His best guess, later half confirmed by a stray comment from Priya at the mailbox, was Harold Fenn, the soft-spoken board accountant who'd looked so visibly uneasy at the August meeting, the one who'd been glancing at his phone under the table like a man already planning his exit. Whatever the exact source, a local news outlet's community affairs reporter, a woman named Teresa Vance, who ran a modestly popular but locally well-trusted Neighborhood Watch segment for the regional CBS affiliate, called Marcus directly on his cell phone on a Thursday evening while he was still at the warehouse. "I've been looking into a pattern of retaliatory fines and liens across a handful of HOAs here in Maple Ridge Township," she told him, her voice brisk and professional, but not unkind. "Your name came up specifically in connection with Willowbrook Glen. I understand you've documented a fairly extensive case already. I'd like to talk with you directly, on the record, if you're willing to go there." Marcus called Attorney Okoro before he ever called Teresa Vance back. "Do it. his attorney said, without a moment's hesitation. Media exposure changes the entire leverage calculation. A board president who's willing to fabricate a violation citation and record a bad faith lien over a parking dispute is going to be considerably less willing to keep doing any of that once there's a camera crew involved. And realistically, it puts real pressure on the other board members too, the ones like Fenn, who I would bet good money never actually wanted their own names anywhere near that fabricated Section 11.2 letter in the first place. Marcus sat for the interview 2 days later, on his own front porch, with 22 feet of his own driveway visible over his shoulder. In nearly every shot, Teresa Vance's cameraman carefully framed. A detail Marcus strongly suspected was not remotely accidental on the reporter's part. He walked her through the spreadsheet, methodically, the same way he'd walk a supervisor through a shipping discrepancy. He showed her all 14 dated photographs of the Escalade sitting in his driveway across 5 separate months. He read aloud, on camera, the exact fabricated language of the Section 11.2 citation directly alongside the actual, real Section 11.2 language governing pet waste disposal, and simply let the discrepancy speak entirely for itself, without editorializing. "I didn't move into this neighborhood looking for a fight," he told her, in the one quote that would end up running in the segment's final closing seconds, the one that would get clipped and reposted independently, more than anything else he said that day. "I just wanted somewhere to park my truck." The segment aired on a Tuesday night in mid-October, under the headline, Neighborhood Watch, when the HOA board becomes the problem. It ran 4 minutes and 20 seconds in total. By Wednesday morning, it had already crossed 60,000 views on the station's own website alone, and a short clip of the Section 11.2 side-by-side comparison had been reposted independently by a local subreddit devoted to Maple Ridge Township news, captioned simply, "HOA President Fines Neighbor for Calling 911 on Her Own Illegally Parked Car." Willowbrook Glen's private community group chat, Marcus heard secondhand from more than one source, did not survive that particular week fully intact. The emergency board meeting was called for October 24th, and this time, the folding chairs in the clubhouse rec room genuinely ran out. 68 households total in the subdivision, and by Marcus's own rough count standing near the doorway that evening, at least 40 of them had someone present, considerably more people than had ever attended, combined, across the entire 11 months Marcus had lived on Larkspur Court up to that point. Denise Calloway sat alone behind the folding table at the front of the room. Harold Fenn had, in the 2 weeks since the segment aired, quietly resigned his board seat by a brief, carefully worded email, citing vague, personal reasons, a resignation that Attorney Okoro would later note, dryly, read suspiciously, like a man building deliberate distance from something he could clearly see coming down the road. The 2 remaining board members sat flanking Denise like reluctant witnesses at their own trial, saying almost nothing the entire evening. Denise opened the meeting by reading from a prepared statement, a visible, transparent attempt to frame the entire matter as nothing more than a media mischaracterization of a private neighbor dispute that has unfortunately been sensationalized for clicks. She got through perhaps half of it before a woman near the back of the room, someone Marcus didn't personally recognize, a homeowner from the far end of the cul-de-sac he'd apparently never met in 11 months, stood up and said, loudly enough to cut clean through the murmur of the room, "Is it true you fined the Ruiz family for a basketball hoop right after some kind of fight about pool committee assignments? Because that's exactly what the records show, and we all just read them." Denise's composure, 6 years in the careful building, cracked visibly in real time in front of 40 assembled households. "I am not going to stand here and relitigate every single enforcement decision this board has made over the past." "That's not actually what she asked you," Frank Kowalski said from the back of the room, arms crossed, not raising his voice at all, which somehow made the words land considerably harder than shouting ever could have. Marcus stood when the floor formally opened for public comment, and this time he didn't need any of Attorney Okoro's coaching to know exactly what to say. He'd lived every word of it firsthand. "I have a small claims filing currently pending against the association and against Denise Calloway personally," he said, into a room that had gone almost perfectly silent. "For the wrongful lien recorded against my property, for the fabricated citation used to justify that lien, and for over a dozen separate documented incidents of unauthorized use of my private driveway by the board president herself. That hearing is scheduled for next month. I'm not asking anyone in this room to simply take my word for any of it. The county recorder's office has the lien on file, publicly searchable by anyone. The municipal police department has the incident report from August, and the meeting minutes, the ones the association was legally required to produce and initially failed to, in full, are available to any homeowner in good standing who submits the same kind of written request I did. Someone near the front of the room, one of the Petersons, from the same family that had, only weeks earlier, invited every single house on the street to their annual cookout except Marcus's, asked, in a noticeably smaller voice than the room was accustomed to hearing from her, "Did any of the rest of us ever get fined like that? I mean actual retaliation, not just a normal violation notice." It turned out, over the next 20 increasingly uncomfortable minutes, that several households had. Not always as severe as what Marcus had documented, not always as thoroughly proven, but a quiet chorus of stories began surfacing across the room. A hedge height violation fine, issued the exact week after one homeowner had questioned a reserve fund line item at a prior meeting. A paint color non-compliance notice, sent to another family just 2 days after they'd publicly raised concerns about a no-bid landscaping contract that happened, as it turned out, to be held by a company owned by Denise's own brother-in-law. The meeting did not resolve anything cleanly that night. Meetings almost never do. But it accomplished something a small claims filing alone never could have. It transformed Denise Calloway, over the course of roughly 90 minutes, from the woman everyone on the street quietly deferred to, without question, into the woman everyone in that room was now actively, openly comparing notes about. She adjourned the meeting abruptly. Without ever properly addressing the recall provision, someone near the back had already started reading aloud from Section 14 of the bylaws, the formal process for removing a sitting board member for cause, requiring signatures from at least 25% of homeowners to force a special vote. By the following Friday, Marcus heard through Priya that the recall petition already had 19 signatures gathered informally. It needed only 17 to proceed. The small claims hearing was set for November 12th at the Franklin County Courthouse, in a modest wood-paneled courtroom that smelled faintly, like every municipal building Marcus had ever set foot in across his entire adult life, of old carpet and stronger coffee than anyone actually drank. He wore a suit he hadn't put on since his own divorce proceedings a year and a half earlier, which felt like an uncomfortable bit of symmetry he chose, deliberately, not to examine too closely that morning. Attorney Okoro laid the whole case out for the presiding judge in under 15 minutes, methodical and entirely unhurried. The 14 documented incidents of Denise Calloway's personal vehicle occupying the Reyes driveway without consent, in direct and repeated violation of the association's own, Section 7.4, as well as Maple Ridge Municipal Code, Section 335.14. The 3 retaliatory fine notices issued within days of Marcus's direct, documented complaints. The fabricated Section 11.2 citation penalizing entirely lawful contact with local police. A citation the association's own governing documents contained no actual provision to support anywhere. And the resulting lien, recorded September 9th, in an amount inflated by a fine the association had no legal authority to issue in the first place, under its own declaration. Denise Calloway's own attorney, a harried-looking man from a firm that evidently represented several homeowners associations across the county and had clearly not expected this particular small claims matter to arrive with quite this volume of organized paperwork behind it, argued that the board had acted entirely within its reasonable discretion to interpret community standards. The exact same phrase Denise herself had used back at the August meeting, which landed no better in a Franklin County courtroom than it had in a folding chair rec room. The presiding judge, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, who had clearly presided over more than a few homeowners association disputes across her years on the bench, did not take terribly long to reach her decision. The association's own declaration is entirely unambiguous on parking violations under Section 7.4, she said, reviewing the exhibit binder Attorney Okoro had prepared and organized with tabs for each incident. The record before me shows the respondent's own personal vehicle was the offending vehicle in this matter, on no fewer than 14 separate documented occasions, and yet no enforcement action whatsoever was taken against the respondent, despite that same section apparently being cited freely against the plaintiff's own. I'll simply note for the record, entirely fabricated violations. As for Section 11.2, I have read it myself this morning. It concerns pet waste disposal along a walking trail. There is no reading of this document, however generous or creative, that could reasonably extend it to cover contact with law enforcement, and I am, frankly, deeply skeptical that this particular fine was ever issued in good faith, rather than as direct retaliation for the plaintiff simply exercising his legal right to call the police about a vehicle blocking his own private driveway. She ruled for Marcus on every single count before her. The lien voided outright and ordered released from the county record within 10 business days. The $475 in wrongful lien fees returned in full. Statutory damages, under the state's wrongful lien statute, totaling $1,500, and $400 in attorney's fees awarded, all owed jointly by the association and by Denise Calloway personally, given the court's explicit finding that the fine and lien had been issued in bad faith and well outside any reasonable interpretation of the association's own governing documents. Denise Calloway did not make eye contact with Marcus on her way out of the courtroom that afternoon. After everything Marcus went through, the lien, the fabricated fines, the cold shoulders from half the street, was it worth it? Have you ever fought your HOA? Won it, lost it, or just walked away? Tell me your story. The recall vote happened 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in early December, in the same clubhouse rec room, this time with folding chairs set up out in the parking lot for the overflow crowd, because the room itself simply could not hold everyone who showed up that morning. Marcus did not organize the recall himself. He was careful, deliberately, throughout the entire process, to let it belong to the neighborhood as a whole, rather than to him personally. This was Priya's insistence, mostly, and it turned out to be genuinely good advice. "You already won your own case," she told him over coffee one morning that November. "Let this next part belong to everyone else. It'll mean more that way, and it'll actually stick." It did. 29 signatures in total, well past the 17 required under the bylaws, forced a special meeting under Section 14. The vote to formally remove Denise Calloway as board president passed 51-9, with the remaining households either abstaining outright or simply not showing up at all. Frank Kowalski, who ran unopposed for the newly vacant board seat because nobody else on the street particularly wanted the headache that came with it, would later joke, with characteristic dryness, that it was the first HOA election in Willowbrook Glen's entire 15-year history with anything resembling actual voter turnout. Denise Calloway did not attend the recall vote in person. She had, by that point, already quietly listed 4421 Larkspur Court for sale, a fact Marcus learned the same way most of the neighborhood eventually did, from a real estate sign that simply appeared on her front lawn 11 days after the courtroom ruling came down. She sold within 6 weeks, at a price Priya described, with what Marcus recognized immediately as considerable personal satisfaction, as not great, honestly, for this particular market. The new board, under Frank's characteristically cautious leadership, and with Priya elected as treasurer at the same special meeting, spent its first 2 full meetings doing something Willowbrook Glen had apparently never once done in its entire 15-year history: methodically auditing the fine collection records against the actual, plain language text of the declaration, section by careful section. 11 prior fines, dating back 3 full years, were found to have no legitimate basis whatsoever in the governing documents and were refunded, entirely unprompted, to the homeowners who had originally paid them, including, to Priya's genuine and visible delight, her own $75 gnome fine from the year before Marcus had even moved onto the street. The new board also passed, by unanimous vote at its very first regular meeting under new leadership, a formal amendment to Section 7, clarifying explicitly that board members and officers were subject to identical parking enforcement standards as any other ordinary homeowner, with a newly added clause, Section 7.6, entirely new language, drafted in no small part by Attorney Okoro herself at Marcus's specific request, offered pro bono as a kind of professional courtesy given everything that had happened, requiring any homeowner requesting temporary use of a neighbor's driveway to obtain explicit written consent in advance, formally logged with the association. No exceptions granted to anyone, regardless of title or tenure. Marcus kept the driveway. He kept the house. He bought a new welcome mat that December, which felt like a small, almost embarrassingly sentimental gesture, even as he set it down on his own porch. But it was his, entirely his, and nobody else's Escalade had touched that concrete since the week of the courtroom ruling back in November. On a Tuesday evening in late December, 8 months and change after the very first apologetic note had appeared tucked under a windshield wiper, Marcus stood out in his driveway, with his truck parked exactly where he wanted it, precisely where it had always belonged, and Frank Kowalski wandered over unhurried with 2 beers, handed one to Marcus without asking whether he wanted it, and said simply, "Feels different around here lately." "Feels like a driveway," Marcus said, turning the cold bottle over once in his hand. "That's really all I ever wanted from this place." He hadn't moved in the end, though he'd thought about it seriously enough, back in October, in the ugliest stretch of the whole fight, when the lien had still been sitting fresh on his title, and half the street wouldn't so much as wave at his mailbox anymore. But standing there in his own driveway that December evening, with a beer in his hand and his own truck parked exactly where it belonged, he finally understood something he hadn't been able to fully articulate to himself until that precise moment. The fight had never really been about the driveway at all. Not really. Not underneath it. It had always been about whether a 5-person volunteer board and one woman's simple convenience got to quietly decide what belonged to him and what didn't. They didn't. Not anymore. Not to Marcus. And as it turned out, not to anyone else left on Larkspur Court either. Priya's tomato plants, the very ones that had once carried a $75 fine for violating a non-existent aesthetic uniformity standard nobody could ever actually locate in writing, were still there the following spring, entirely unbothered by anyone, blooming right on schedule against her back fence. The Petersons, to their quiet credit, were the first to walk over and apologize that winter, standing on Marcus's porch in the cold with a plate of Christmas cookies neither of them particularly wanted to eat, admitting they'd stayed away out of fear rather than dislike, and that fear, once Denise Calloway no longer had any leverage to weaponize, had simply nowhere left to live. The Osei Botangs took a little longer to come around, but by the following spring's community cookout, the first one in the new board's history to actually go out to all 68 households without exception, they showed up with a folding table and a tray of jollof rice, and stayed until the sun went down, which Priya considered, only half joking, the real end of the whole affair. Frank Kowalski's security footage, the same thumb drives he'd once dropped quietly in Marcus's mailbox without ceremony, eventually became something of a running joke on the street. Frank installed 2 more cameras that winter, angled at the shared entrance sign and the retention pond, less out of necessity than out of what he called, with a completely straight face, institutional memory. The idea being that no future board president in Willowbrook Glen would ever again get the chance to quietly rewrite what had actually happened on Larkspur Court. Attorney Okoro sent Marcus a card that Christmas, a simple one, no invoice attached, just a line thanking him for being, in her words, the rare client who actually kept better records than the board he was suing. Marcus taped it to the inside of a kitchen cabinet, where he could see it some mornings while making coffee. A small private reminder of the year a driveway taught him exactly how much a piece of paper, filed correctly and on time, could actually be worth. If your HOA has ever tried to make you feel small over something that was always, legally, entirely and unambiguously yours to begin with, subscribe, and stick around, because HOA Horror Files has a great many more of these stories still coming. And every single homeowner who ever walks through one of them eventually learns the exact same thing Marcus Reyes did on Larkspur Court. The paperwork always tells on somebody, eventually, whether they ever wanted it to or not.